Welcome and good evening. This is the biannual Catholic Social Tradition Conference hosted by the Institute for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame. My name is Suzanne Shanahan and I direct the Institute for Social Concerns. For folks unfamiliar with the Institute, we are an interdisciplinary group of faculty, staff, students, and community members committed to a normative proposition. The proposition that a just world is a beautiful world. As the home for justice at Notre Dame, we respond to the complex demands of justice and signs of the times through research for the common good, justice education, and critical conversations. Guided by Catholic social tradition, we believe that how we do our work is just as important as what we achieve in our work. This conference is certainly no exception. As I reflect on this conference during this Lenten season, and both the topic of it, interdisciplinary responses to religious nationalism, but also the deliberatively contemplative arc leading us to a conversation on beloved community, I am reminded of Richard Rohr's reflection on Lent. He says, there are two moments that matter. One is when you know your one and only life is absolutely valuable and alive. The other is when you know your life, as presently lived, is entirely pointless and empty. You need both of them to keep you going in the right direction. Lent is about both. The first such moment gives you energy and joy by connecting you and your ultimate source and ground. The second gives you limits and boundaries and a proper humility. So you keep seeking the source and ground, and not just your small self. Before I turn it over to the next speaker, I just wanted to express a word of gratitude. I imagine you'll hear lots of thanks throughout this 2 days, but I wanted to share my own. In many ways, a conference like this is like throwing a wedding. A huge affair, lots of details one never imagined were possible. So I did want to note a few folks. First, thanks to Professor Margie Pfeil, who has spent much of the past 18 months meticulously curating the experience that will unfold over the next 2 days. In this work, she was joined in friendship and collegiality by Professors Jenna Hunter-Bowman and Drew Straight from the Anabaptist Mennonite Seminary. Margie's partner at every stage and at every turn was Paula Muller, who ensured that every single detail enhances this contemplative experience. But also thanks to our mighty communications team, Todd, Javi, and David, who you'll see throughout this couple of days taking notes and taking photos. And with that, I am delighted to pass the baton to Dr. Beverly Lapp, Vice President and Academic Dean at the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, for a brief word of welcome. Thank you all.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you all as we begin the 2025 Catholic Social Traditions Conference on the vitally important theme of religious nationalism. I am bringing greetings on behalf of Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. We are thrilled to be co-sponsors of this conference, and I'm particularly grateful to AMBS professors Jana Hunter-Bowman and Drew Straight for their steady and creative work as members of the planning committee. This conference is deeply resonant with the scholarship and teaching they have each been engaged with, and with our collective educational mission at AMBS to educate leaders to work for God's reconciling mission in the world. We are so pleased that both AMBS faculty members and students are part of the learning that will take place here at Notre Dame among this amazing group of scholars and practitioners. At AMBS, we structure our curriculum and our pedagogies around a framework of knowing, doing, and being. I have been thinking a lot lately about how these modes of experience speak to the time of profound crisis that we are in. These modes can be in tension. There is the need to increase our knowing, to more fully understand the why of what is happening, where this is all coming from, and how our varied and interconnected disciplines and traditions can help us find a way through. There is the need to increase our doing, to protect those we can, to express solidarity, to protest, to change minds, to listen carefully. And of course, our being needs tending. We need to be intentional and serious about our emotional, spiritual, and physical wellness. We need to be grounded in integrity through the tumult and through the work. As we navigate a multitude of urgencies, we need each other as much as we ever have. In reviewing the names and institutions represented in the conference program, I'm reminded of the resources we have in each other, in our scholarship, in our neighborhoods, our organizations, and our religious traditions. We can only do this work in collaboration and in community. I really appreciate the intentionality of the conference design to help us all grow in our knowing, doing, and being, and to more clearly see what we perhaps have not wanted to see, that the current and rapidly evolving state of affairs has not emerged suddenly. As we know, it has been unfolding for a very long period of time. While religion is at the center of so much that is going wrong, our faith traditions and sacred texts can and should be at the center of a spiritually grounded, joyful, resilient, and effective resistance that moves our human story towards what is right for all of creation. I want to thank you and Notre Dame on behalf of AMBS for joining us in community as we seek to faithfully respond to the signs of these times. Earlier this evening, I was able to spend a little time with 4 Notre Dame undergraduates who are each adding a minor in Catholic social traditions to their studies. Marshall, Jack, Madeline, and Iyabo, you give me hope. As our time together begins, may we all allow ourselves to breathe deeply. We will need to over the next few days. In the words I heard from Iyabo just about an hour ago, may we remember that we are beloved, and may we each remember that we are each having an impact just by existing, and we never know who we are affecting. We are truly honored to learn together with each of you and to build relationships that will sustain us in the work that is upon us and that lies ahead. Thank you.
Well, good evening. My name is Margaret Pfeil, and I am delighted to be here on behalf of the Institute for Social Concerns in the Department of Theology. And I reiterate and echo the welcome to you all. I'd like to begin first with an acknowledgement. I invite us to acknowledge our presence in the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi people, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. Professor Shanahan already extended words of thanks to Jana Hunter-Bowman and Drew Strait. I would add my colleague David Claremont in the Theology Department, who also has been an integral part of the planning process. And In addition to other Institute colleagues who helped make this happen, Geneva Hutchinson has carefully curated art that I'll say more about in a minute. Thanks as well to all the McKenna Hall staff here, dining services, Notre Dame Studios, and many other departments, and especially all of our co-sponsors, and particularly the Democracy Initiative and the Franco Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts. Please join me in thanking them. An integral part of the Catholic social tradition is the dynamic relationship between contemplation and action. In this conference, we invite you into a contemplative space to engage in thoughtful, mindful discourse about the relationship of church and state in society as we mark the 60th anniversary of the landmark Vatican II texts, Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae. To help this conference community discern the signs of the times together and to listen for key moments in the next few days, we are very grateful to Dr. Laurie Cassidy and Dr. Felipe Hinojosa for serving as designated conference listeners. And if you could just raise your hands, and please join me in thanking them as well. Thank you. Contemplation and action are also at the heart of Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of the beloved community. And our conference will culminate in an invitation to discern what your own commitment to this vision of the beloved community might entail in response to religious nationalism. Together in this conference, we lift up the values of ecumenical and interreligious collaboration in ensuring the dignity and flourishing of each and every human being and all of creation, beginning with the most vulnerable among us. These commitments are at the heart of the common good, as well as the beloved community. So in this spirit, we invite you to adopt some particular guidelines for discourse throughout our time together. We ask that you please first engage in discussion in a dignified and respectful manner. Secondly, that you follow the established procedure for plenary Q&A, which I will explain in a few moments. And thirdly, that we foster a spirit of curiosity and a desire to understand the viewpoints of other participants. And finally, a word about two particular invitations. As I mentioned, my colleague Geneva Hutchinson has curated a beautiful, compelling selection of artistic works around our gathering space. So we invite you to consider the theme of religious nationalism through the epistemological lens of the arts. How might these works help you to consider facets of religious nationalism in a different way? Please take time to contemplate them. At the end of each evening, we invite you to meditate in silence, personally and in community, in room B01 in the basement of this building. And that's, of course, optional. So at this point, I'd like to invite our keynote panelists to come up to the stage, and we'll prepare to transition. So as we transition now into the first keynote, I invite you to just take a moment of silence as we become mindful of our breathing and allow ourselves to center in this place together. Thank you. So it's my great privilege and joy to introduce this very distinguished panel. And I'd like to say a word about each person before we get started. Dr. Anthea Butler is the Geraldine R. Segal Professor in American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Butler's recent book is White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. Professor Butler is the winner of the 2022 Martin Marty Award for Public Understanding of Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Reggie Williams is Associate Professor in Theological Studies at St. Louis University, and his research interests include Black theology, Black studies, Dietrich Bonhoeffer studies, Black arts, and Christian ethics. He is the author of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology, and an Ethic of Resistance, and he is currently at work on 2 manuscripts, Holy, Holy, An Ethics After Whiteness, Yale University Press, and The Bonhoeffer Conundrum, A Complicated Christian Response to Fascism. Dr. Gary Adler is Associate Professor of Sociology at Penn State University, and his research examines how culture works at the intersection of religion and politics, and has appeared in Social Forces, Socius, and several other journals. He is the author or editor of 3 books, Secularism, Catholicism, and the Future of Public Life, Empathy Beyond U.S. Borders, and American Parishes. And he was a 2023-4 Fulbright Fellow and currently co-directs the American Local Leaders Study, an NSF-funded project about how local government officials engage with religion and navigate religion-state law in practice. And Dr. Ryan Burge is an associate professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. He is the author or co-author of 4 books, including The Nuns, 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America, and The Great De-Churching. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Politico. He has also appeared on 60 Minutes, where Anderson Cooper called him, quote, one of the leading data and analysts of religion and politics in the United States, unquote. He was a pastor of an American Baptist church for over 17 years. So please join me in welcoming our speakers tonight. And so each person will have about 15 minutes to speak, and toward the end, I'll just hold up this pink card with about a minute to go. We will have plenary Q&A after everyone has spoken, and I'll say more about that at that point. Thank you.
You know, I was hoping that I didn't have to go first because, you know, I don't want to depress you all, but I'm going to depress you. And I want to say at the outset of this, I'm kind of acting out of what I normally do. And what I mean by that is, since 1/7/21, all I've talked about is Christian nationalism. I'm a trained 2,000-year church historian. What I do has been profoundly different up to this point. But my training really helped me to understand what is happening right now, and perhaps, hopefully, what won't happen, but I'm not quite sure that's the case. And so I want to talk about this in a certain kind of way, and it may be more in your face than what you're normally used to, but I want to be in your face because I need to be in your face. I need you to understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. We are in the middle of the second coup. We have a dictator, not a president. America is on its way to becoming a full authoritarian nation. If you don't believe that, and if you can't keep up, let me encourage you to try to keep up in the ways that you can, because it is happening right in front of you. People on the election day wanted cheaper eggs. You're going to get more than cheaper eggs. You're going to get expensive eggs. You're going to get people renditioned. You are going to get people in your neighborhoods taken out of your neighborhoods. You are going to get persecution. It's here. It's not a surprise. This is what Christian nationalism has wrought. If you thought Christian nationalism was just a nice phrase that you could pander around for people and make you feel better and wave a flag at church on Sundays, that's not what this is. It is a takeover. It is a takeover of a nation that was founded on democratic principles. I live in Philadelphia. I can walk to Independence Hall. I know the founders and the framers did not make this country for me, because in my body, they would have had me enslaved. But I come from a tradition of people who have fought for democracy. And I gotta tell you, after the 3.5 years I've been doing this work, I'm a little bit tired right now. I've been doing this for you. I look across this room and I know where I am. I'm in South Bend, Indiana. I see everybody's face. And I wanna tell you that I don't have anything against you, but I'm kind of tired, white people, okay? I'm tired. And as a Black Catholic woman, fighting not just for justice within the boundaries of this country, but also in the church, it gets a little tiring to talk about the same thing all the time. So I want to put a definition of white Christian nationalism out here. And I'm saying white Christian nationalism for a reason. You're probably thinking, well, there's lots of people who are Christian nationalists. They're not just white. And that's true. But one of the things I say in my book, White Evangelical Racism, The Promise of Morality in America, is about how people want whiteness, the promise of whiteness. What does whiteness do? Why did we have people who were undocumented, Latinos and others, saying that they would vote for Donald Trump? Because they wanted that promise, they wanted that power, they wanted that thing that was going to help them succeed in this country. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that they didn't realize that was the same thing that was going to get them renditioned. And I want to talk about that in a minute. So let me give you the definition that I wrote back in 2021. What is white Christian nationalism? Simply put, is the belief that America's founding is based on Christian principles. White Protestant Christianity is the operational religion of the land. Notice I'm saying Protestant, I didn't say Catholics. Y'all get to slip in underneath the rug as long as you accede to Protestant ways of thinking. And that Christianity should be the foundation of how the nation develops its laws, principles, and policies. I can sum this up by Representative Lauren Boebert, who says there's no separation of church and state. You know, forget that guy, Thomas Jefferson, that wrote that Danbury letter, okay? For you historians in the room, there's no separation. What kind of Christianity and what kind of nationalism? What is the basis of white Christian nationalism? It appears in these ways. America is a divinely appointed nation by God that is Christian. If you've seen books by David Barton, you know what this is. I'm not even going to go further. America's founders, rather than wanting to disestablish religion as a unifier for the nation, were in fact establishing a nation based on Christian principles with white men as leaders. I like to say that the way you sum this up is to think about Ronald Reagan's A City on the Hill. You know, he takes that speech and turns it into something else. And then again, it gets turned into something else with the MAGA movement. Others, Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and immigrants would accept and cede to this narrative of America as a Christian nation and accept their leadership. America has a special place not only in world history, but in biblical scripture, especially concerning the return of Christ. And then 5, there's no separation of church and state. If I were doing a normal talk about Christian nationalism, let people know what it was, the clip I always use is General Flynn, who was in San Antonio at a church, a big meeting of Renew America. And he said during this meeting that if we are going to have one nation under God, which we must, we are to have one religion, one nation under God and one religion under God. And that religion is Christianity. Now we have this out of the way that we are working with the foundational kind of thing. Let me not spend time with that, because what I want to talk about is not to argue about what Christian nationalism is or isn't, how much it appears or it doesn't appear. We got people up here who do better numbers than I do. And I don't count, that's not what I do. I only count my wallet. I didn't get on a plane to talk to you about that. You got great people to talk to you about this. I want to talk to you about how Christianity has destroyed democracy in America. And that is a big statement. That is a statement that will frighten you because you think that Christianity is the basis of our democracy. But you know, the Polish and the Greeks and all of that, they weren't thinking about Christianity back then. Jesus wasn't around. But you need to understand that this brand of Christian nationalism does not want a Christian world, nor does it want democracy. It wants power. How did we get here? And I want to go through these things very quickly because I want to get to the what's happening now. The religious right has always wanted limited governance. When you heard people say, we don't want government involved in things, they said that because they felt that government oversight was too much, it was overreach. This did not start with Roe versus Wade. You got to go back to the 50s and even earlier than that. Think about prayer in schools, think about segregation, think about civil rights. There's lots of things there that let you know that people did not want government involved in all this. I think about Jerry Falwell in 1965, who had a speech called Ministers and Marches, where he said to basically about the civil rights movement that ministers should not be in the streets. That was 1965. By 1979, he had started the moral majority. So clearly he changed his mind about all of that. LGBTQI rights and the fight against gay marriage. This has been a big part of what has made this turn come around. The pushback against education in K through 12 and other schools. We could talk about school captures. I'm from Texas. We can talk about how school boards were taken over. We can talk about why schools have textbooks that are predominantly based on the Texas Board of Education, because they are the biggest purchasers of school board books in this country, and history books. But then we can get down to some things that are not so historic but have happened in the last few years. The first thing is critical race theory. If you know what critical race theory is in this room, raise your hand. Great, because most people don't. But they got scared of it, okay? And they got scared of it, and Christopher Rufo did a magnificent job. And I say that with derision in my voice, because what he did was make everybody think that kindergartners were learning CRT. And they weren't. But it turned out to be one of the biggest boogeymen in the corner. Black Lives Matter. This was a big thing right when George Floyd died, was a big swell, and you had everybody out in the streets. Black Lives Matter had been going on for a while, but you had the swell of people, and the pushback against that has put us where we are right now. DEI. I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten an email that says, you're just a DEI hire. DEI is code word for the N-word. I need you to understand that right now, and I want to be blunt about that and be real clear about it. Because DEI is about how are we going to wipe out history? How do we wipe out the history of everybody else who helped in this nation? That's what your Christian nationalism is doing. Backlash against the Me Too movement. I know that's surprising to some of you, but it really is. Why do we have the kinds of people like Andrew Tate and others coming into this country being welcomed back by our president? Trans panic. This one grieves me so deeply I cannot even tell you. Trans people are being made into the scapegoats for everything. If there's going to be another time when people have to wear a triangle, they're probably going to be the first ones to get it. Because what is happening in this country right now about trans things is ridiculous. My institution had a trans athlete on the swimming team. We are being clocked for $175 million at the University of Pennsylvania because of a person who has already left and graduated. Because the alumni of the university, Donald Trump, wants to punish us. Sex abuse panics. This one is one of my ones that really get me, because all of the accusations about pedophilia and everything else, and I cannot count to you how many Protestant pastors I have clocked who have been in sex abuse scandals. And then finally, this one is maybe surprising to you, but maybe not. COVID. COVID brought on all of these conspiracies. It brought on the anti-vax movement. It brought on all of these things. And all of this has come together to destroy the social safety net, which is why I think you all are here. You want to talk about how we're going to fight this. But that is the basis of how Christian nationalism gets in. Christian nationalism makes you think, oh, I'm for the nation. I am for the leaders that are talking about being a Christian nation. But there's nothing right now that has anything to do with Christianity. Nothing. And I only want to talk about two things, because there's so much we could talk about right now. We could talk about the destruction of the government by a man who's probably not even a citizen, and probably didn't even get here, right, who is unfortunately another graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, Elon Musk. It's galling to me that you're being told that you can't protest and you can't do anything because it is against everything. And now we're having Department of Homeland Security people come into universities. This has happened already at Columbia. We've had somebody picked up from Georgetown today. Hopefully he will not be taken out of this country. We have had people who have been picked up who are citizens of this country, who have had to prove that their citizenship was. And hopefully they get out. There's probably citizens locked up right now that we don't know about. If you didn't read yesterday in The Guardian, the Canadian woman who was locked up for almost a month, a little bit more, how she was treated, the letters she got from people who were locked in with her and moved to several locations, all because of a faulty work permit, which is no reason to lock somebody up when they've got a passport and they can just get back sent to their country. We are dealing with a big issue. You're here because this is about Catholic social teaching. And part of Catholic social teaching is to think about the preferential option for the poor. But I'm here to tell you that this administration is about the preferential option for the rich. It is not the preferential option for the poor. It is not a preferential option for people who need assistance. Your social safety net is being dragged up from under your feet right now, whether that's Medicare, Medicaid, and everything else. Let's talk about this other thing real quick. Then I'll come back to immigration in a minute. Let us talk about USAID and what has happened. 27 religious organizations right now are suing the Trump administration because of all the things that have been taken. The greatest moment for me in all of this was to read that Franklin Graham did not realize that they were going to be taking money from Samaritan's purse. Can you imagine? This man has caped for Donald Trump the whole time and did not realize that when USAID was killed, that meant the money that he was getting from the government to help people from somewhere else was not going to go to him. That's Christian nationalism. That's believing in a leader who panders to Christianity, but at the same time is taking mouths out of kids' mouths, who is taking medicine away from people all around the world, who has ships full of grain sitting in places like the Port of Houston and everywhere else, waiting to go someplace. This is a man who's starving out farmers right now. This is a man who's firing people through Doge. This is what Christian nationalism has brought to this country. So I am not here to argue about what Christian nationalism is or isn't. I'm here to tell you this is what Christianity is doing to your nation right now. These people who say that they are Christians. Now, in an academic way, I don't want to argue about who is a Christian and who's not. But what I do want to argue with is that every time you hear this word Christian nationalism, you need to understand that people are using God to persecute other people. This is history. It's not something that's different. You can look around the world right now and see whether you're talking about Russia and Ukraine, that's a religious fight. Israel, religious fight. India, maybe Hinduism, but it's a religious fight. Turkey, Brazil, Hungary, all of this has basis in a kind of nationalism that bases itself in religion. And so what I hope we can do here tonight, and I'm ready to answer any questions you have, is to think about the ways in which this Christian belief that rests on the crucified Jesus has been used and twisted to oppress and to take away people's rights and to make people be less than. And in this country, the way that this has happened is because of race and because of racism. If you don't think that this is a white supremacist project, think again. It is. And so you may disagree with me, but in about a month or two, when we have people who do not have jobs, people who have lost their ways, kids that are not eating in schools because there's no more money for the food that they get because they weren't able to pay for this. When your neighbors are suffering, when your maid gets picked up, and you don't know where she is, that's going to be the outgrowth of what Christian nationalism has done. Thank you.
Should we go to the line, I guess? Sure. Okay. Can we do the slides for Ryan Burge? Thank you, man. Well, I don't know how to follow Anthea except with graphs. So we're going to do graphs, I guess. I don't know. Do you like graphs? If you say no, just hang out for 15 minutes. I'll be done quick, I promise. I'm just going to show you graphs about what the data says about Christian nationalism, right? Questions we use, how it's changed over the last 15 years or so. So Really, the academic study of Christian nationalism started with a book called Taking Back America for God by Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead. I assume that some of you are aware of said book. It became somewhat of a sensation. Their book was actually based on these questions that come from the Baylor Religion Survey, which they've been doing now for about 20 years. The top row shows you the answers to those questions in 2007, and then the row below that, they asked the exact same questions in the exact same way in 2021. So that gives us about as good a comparison as you're going to get between how people answer those questions over a 15-year period of time. So first question, the federal government should advance Christian values. In 2007, 55% of Americans agreed with that statement. In 2021, 38% of Americans agree with that statement, down 17 points. The federal government should allow prayer in public school, was almost 70%, now down to 55%. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces, almost 70% in 2007, down to 50%, 19-point drop. Federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, 27% down to 22%, although the big jump was in the undecided category. You can make your own guesses about what that means. The federal government should enforce the strict separation of church and state. 51% of that people agreed with that in 2007, and now the number is 62%, a jump of about 11 points. The only one where it goes the opposite direction, and I do not know how to explain this. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. 32% of Americans agreed with that in 2007. That number went to 37% in 2021. So on the first measures at the top, Christian nationalism scores have gone down, and on the last one at the bottom, they've gone up. Here's what it looks like if you just visualize the distribution of these scores. Okay, so 6 would mean you answered, strongly disagree to all these questions, and 30 would mean you agreed all the Christian nationalist questions. The mean score in 2007 was about 18 on this scale, and now it's dropped to 16.5 over the last 14 years. So from a purely empirical perspective, Christian nationalism has actually retreated just a little bit when it comes to survey data, just a few points, not a gargantuan swing. Now, you have a good question, I'm thinking, some of you methodologists right now, which is the American electorate's changed a lot in the last 15 years, most especially the idea that the share of Americans who claim no religious affiliation was about 12% in 2007, and it was about 28% in 2021. So I took the nuns out. Guess what? The thing I showed you in the first graph, it's still there. Even when you leave only religious people in the sample, the answers to these questions look almost exactly the same in this graph as they do in the first graph. So this cannot be explained simply by saying, well, there are more non-religious people in America, therefore Christian nationalism has gone down. If you break it down by different religious traditions, here's the mean score in 2007 in the blue, and then the mean score in 2021 in the tan. As you can see, for evangelicals, it went from about 16 to 14. The big drop is the main line. This really fascinates me. They actually scored statistically the same as evangelicals in 2007, and then they dropped from about 16.5 to 10 in a 15-year period of time. So that's the biggest decline right there. Black Protestants did not move. 12 in both. Catholics went from about 12.5 down to about 9.5. So 3-point drop there. And then your other faith group dropped significantly. Obviously, the no religion group scores the lowest on Christian. There are a little bit of Christian nationalist responses among the nuns. I know it doesn't make any sense, but welcome to the wonderful world of survey data. Nobody makes any sense sometimes. So this is what you deal with. Now, so here are the responses to a lot of those questions. I broke it down by evangelicals are in the left 2 bars, and then mainline are in the next 2 bars. Black Protestants are in the 3rd bars over, and Catholics are in the 4th bar over. So you can see the individual responses to these questions and how they changed. There's a couple things I want to point out here. The main line up there in the top, I don't know if I'll go that, oh no, I can't do that, forward. The main line on the question, the federal government should advocate Christian values, 79% of the main line agreed with that statement in 2007. It dropped in half by 2021. Down to 40%. Humongous drop there. You also see a drop of almost 30 points on the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. So what you're really seeing, I think, is big drops, especially among the mainline, a little bit among Catholics, and a little bit less among evangelicals, okay? Now, this is other questions. Oh, I broke it down by partisanship here. So you can even see like how partisanship plays a role in all this stuff. Democrats, in 2007, 42% of Democrats agreed the federal government should advocate Christian values. That is now 20%. So that share dropped in half in 15 years. For Republicans, it went from 75 to 64. You see clearly here the biggest drops are among the Democrats in the sample, and the smallest drops are in the Republicans in the sample, okay? Although, you know, the success of the United States is part of God's plan. For Republicans, went from 46% to 59%. So a 13-point jump there. Definitely an odd result. Now, PRI teamed up with Brookings in 2023 and asked a bunch of questions about Christian nationalism. And they said, do you have a very favorable, somewhat unfavorable, very unfavorable, or have you not heard of Christian nationalism? About a third of the sample had never heard of the term Christian nationalism before. Okay? That's something I want to make very clear to you. All of you in the room have heard of it before. You're not the average American. Okay? One thing I have to tell my undergraduates and my grad students is your world is not the world. Okay? The pond you swim in is not what the guy that I, go to the bar with on Friday night swims in. He lives in a different information world than you do. Lots and lots of Americans have no idea what the word Christian nationalism means. And that's an important point. So, if you break it down by partisanship, guess who are the most likely to have never heard of Christian nationalism? Conservatives. Who are the least likely? Extremely liberal people. 92% of extremely liberal people had heard of Christian nationalism before. And amongst conservatives, it was about 50-50. Almost half of them had never heard of the term Christian nationalism before. So you can clearly see there's a partisan thing going on here, right? Where Republicans, maybe they are aware and just don't want to act like they're aware, but they definitely on polls say they're not aware of the term Christian nationalism, while liberals and Democrats are much more likely to have heard the term Christian nationalism. How about we break it down by age and partisanship? The people that are the most likely to have heard about Christian nationalism are Democrats across the board. And there's no age gradient here among Democrats. 25% of young Democrats had never heard of Christian nationalism. It was 26% of retired Democrats had never heard of Christian nationalism. The group in the sample that was the least likely to have ever heard of Christian nationalism were old Republicans. 55 and up. Almost half of them had never heard of the term Christian nationalism before. So there's definitely, the Democrats, there's no age gradient. With Republicans, there's a small age grade, about 10 points different from the youngest Republicans to the oldest Republicans. What about education and ideology? The group in the sample that was the most likely to have heard of Christian nationalism were Democrats with a graduate degree. Maybe a few of those in the room right now. The least likely group to have heard of Christian nationalism are Republicans who have a high school diploma or less. So you're seeing the pattern that's emerging here, right? Older people are less likely to know, less educated people are less likely to know. Republicans are less likely to know about Christian nationalism than liberals, young people, educated people. It's definitely not a term that has a widespread pickup in the American discourse. And this might be the most telling slide of all. Share saying they'd never heard of Christian nationalism based on the media source they trust the most. Local news, half the people who watch the local news the most have never heard of Christian. Because I don't think the local news is covering Christian nationalism. Maybe they are, but they're usually covering like robberies where I live and, traffic tickets and things like that because I live in a small town. The group of people next were people who watch Fox News. 43% of Fox News watchers had never heard of Christian nationalism before. The group that was the most likely to have heard of Christian nationalism? People who watched MSNBC. So you're seeing, This term exists, and we talk about it in the ivory tower, and Sam Perry and I talk about this a little bit. When you do public scholarship, who actually reads what you're writing and takes it in and thinks about it? The answer is not everybody, right? It's not getting into the entire discourse. The media ecosystems that we live in say that certain groups are hearing more of it, and other groups are not hearing very much. We've heard about the manosphere too much the last 6 months, right? It's where young men live with the Joe Rogans and the Theo Vaughns and the Andrew Tates, and young women live in a totally different media ecosystem. Well, that does have actual effects on what we know about the world around us, and the data is exceedingly clear on that. People who watch MSNBC are twice as likely to have heard of Christian nationalism as people who watch Fox News. I think one of the big problems that we struggle with this term academically is, what is Christian nationalism? Is not an easily defined concept. I'll give you an example. I'll skip it. You don't want a regression. Who wants that? Nobody. This is a tweet from an editor at Mother Jones Magazine. I don't know if you guys have seen this tweet before. Creeping Christian nationalism alert. Alaska Air flight attendant just wished us a blessed night as we landed in San Francisco. To groans. Other adjectives that would have suffice. Great, awesome, fabulous, amazing, fantastic. As my roommate said, this ain't Montgomery, sweetie. As you can probably guess, the responses on Twitter were not too kind to Miss Clara Jeffrey. Things like, she sounds like a nice person, to be honest. From start to finish, this tweet is art. Put it in the encyclopedia under affluent white coastal American liberalism, and no other text will be required. Do you get alarmed if people say, bless you, after you sneeze? Or, I'm sorry this happened to you. Your reaction is very normal and healthy, and the flight attendant was definitely intent on oppressing you with her faith. Do you see the point I'm trying to make here? Like, at some point, we have to say what is and what isn't Christian nationalism. I can think we can all admit, I hear that all the time. When you go to Chick-fil-A and have the sandwich with the oppression tied into it, which is delicious, don't get me wrong. Not the oppression, the sandwich. And they say, have a blessed day. Is that Christian nationalism? I don't think it is. But I also had someone this week tell me their vote should count more on election day because they're a Christian and their neighbor's a Muslim. That is Christian nationalism. Now, how about this? Congress begins every session every day with a non-sectarian prayer. Is that Christian nationalism? I think if you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. I think the problem is when you set someone up to look for something, they're going to find examples of it when they don't even exist. My evangelical friends have what we call the evangelical persecution complex. They want to find themselves being oppressed all the time for things that are not oppressive at all, right? It's a thing they look for. If you're taught to look for something, you'll find it, right? Even when it might not be there. And evangelicals do the same thing. White evangelicals, PRI says they believe they're more discriminated against than Muslims in America. And they will say that to you with a straight face. I will end with a handy-dandy flow chart from the late, great Rachel Held Evans. He said, are you being oppressed or persecuted? Did someone threaten your life, safety, civil liberties, or freedom to worship? Then, if the answer is yes, then you are being persecuted. If you say no, did someone wish you happy holidays? You're not being persecuted. Right? I think the issue here with Christian nationalism is, from an academic perspective, we've got to get better at defining what it is and what it isn't. As it stands right now, it seems like it's become a cudgel that some people on the left throw at people on the right. When I say I want the kingdom of God to come to the world, is that Christian nationalism? It depends on who's saying it, right? Because I want a kingdom of peace and justice and equality and love and forgiveness and reconciliation. That's the kingdom I'm talking about. When other people could say that, I want white Christians to kill everyone who's not a white Christian. We have to be clear about what terms mean and what they don't mean. Otherwise, everything and nothing is Christian nationalism. Thanks, everybody.
He handed me something that looks like a piece from a kid's board game. It's the clicker. That's pretty cool. Well, I mean, as these things go, you sit for a long time and you hear people talk and so forth, and you try and stay awake. I hope to keep you interested and awake. The content is probably the most important thing that we can be talking about today. In our time, there is likely nothing more important to be discussing than this very subject. I see familiar faces. It's wonderful to see you. I have a few slides that I put together, rushing to make sure that this thing had some pictures on the plane. And I hope to make sense of what I'm trying to communicate with you today. To sum up, what I want to be getting at today, to some degree, is what Dr. Burge was just saying. What are we referring to? On one hand, okay, that's supposed to, I should have had them coming in one at a time, but I hope you leave with some sense of what, after I've spoken, some sense of what I mean by nationalism. And the even more complicated concept within nationalism, nation. I'm going to be describing them in this way: two interlocking concepts, united as elements of a single story that is meant to make sense of who we are and why we're here. Nationalism, nation, an aspect of nationalism. When we're face to face, we have our interaction and we know what we're doing and why we're here and so forth. There's a story that maybe exists presumptively in our heads of what we're doing. When we are not face to face and there's a larger group, the group consists of a larger community, we have an imagined story of why we're here and who we are. That, to some degree, is what I'm getting at as nation. And the nationalism is the effort to have the political apparatus that run the group be based on the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Nation. 2, the story creates characters. Real people are made to play roles without merit or consent. The story of who we are includes bad guys, nefarious people, who help the ideal figures become legible. Happens in the movies and in the books that you read. It's a practice of people making. 3, white nationalism, what I will be describing white Christian nationalism as, simply white nationalism, is a story, a mythic narrative of a type of community. It is an apologetics that makes ownership of all things related to heaven and earth and violence a sacred good. So that's the setup. What I say today, I say as a constructive theologian on one hand, as I feel it's imperative for the theologian to recognize their rootedness within their context. On the other hand, I have in mind the vocation of a Christian ethicist, which means that I am occupied with the questions, what shall we do and how shall we live? With these qualifiers in mind, I begin with a concern, what we've already heard today so far. A large part of what we struggle with in these perilous times is the meaning of nationalism. Because it is such an expansive concept, we find it hard to understand and thus difficult to address. Along with this problem of understanding nationalism is another, even perhaps more challenging one, the idea of nation. These two ideas, nationalism and nation, are before us in all of their complexity as we seek to understand the most pressing crisis today, white Christian nationalism. Dorothy Zerla referred to it as Christofascism. To sum up what she was describing, a variety of the faith that blends Christian authoritarianism indistinguishably with patriotism, resulting in moral justification for mass use of violence. Some of you know Dorothy Zerla on this, and let me just be clear that I'm paraphrasing and using my own interpretation of what she's saying here. W.E.B. Du Bois referred to it as the religion of whiteness, a mythic devotion to an idealized human type, viewed as having divine rights to or proper ownership of all things related to heaven and earth. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "One cannot worship the false god of nationalism and the God of Christianity at the same time." Yet in our time, the phenomenon identified by these historical voices is upon us with nearly as great a force as any other time in U.S. history. I submit that this is the most important conversation that we can be having today, as the concept of white Christian nationalism so profoundly shapes the structure of our life together and the future of our presence on this planet. Domination, extraction, violence, sacred apologetics. In these brief moments, I'll describe this problem simply as white nationalism, rather than with the qualifier Christian. I do this not because I don't believe that the movement is religious, but precisely because it is. How religion is present is most important. By recognizing it as white nationalism, we can see a number of important things more clearly. First, there is a very long history at play in this phenomenon that is often missed. It has roots in the European invention of human difference, racialism, or rather whiteness, which is simply an argument for an idealized category of white as the sole bearers of the image of God in contrast with all others. And when I refer to whiteness, like a very dear friend of mine whom we have conversation with all the time, a very good theologian who calls himself theologian adjacent, he refers to whiteness not as a quality of any demographic of people, but as an epistemological process, as a way of knowing and organizing life on the planet. It is the inventor of human difference. And that knowledge of human difference that it invents is in fact an argument for ascendancy. So white people have a different relationship to whiteness than do anyone else. Some scholars claim that this arrangement of white as ascendant over everyone else began with the medieval religious and political distinction between the priest and the laity, a sacred, profane dualism. Others describe it as an expansion of European feudalism, another version of the same sacred, profane, aristocrat, serf binary. That binary is the scaffolding that moves into the world in the discovery of the worlds beyond Europe, encoding the foreign bodies and their communities with moral meaning to inform interactions between Europe and Europe's others. Second, and more explicitly, that unique relationship with God is characterized by identification of the idealized of Europe with Christ, risen with all power, the second Adam, the savior of the world through culture and civilization. Functionally, what that has given us is a clear yet unarticulated belief in a white demographic that is historically autonomous and associated with intrinsic morality and with the presumption of innocence as a naturally occurring racial/ethnic trait, over and against those who are historically dependent, associated with intrinsic deviance and the presumption of wrongdoing as a naturally occurring racial trait. Concrete example. In the remaining time that I have, I want to show how these things are at work by offering a case study of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's moment in relationship to our own. He was born on February 4th, 1906, 35 years after a war victory over the French gave birth to Germany as an empire in 1871. He was raised in a Germany that knew an ethnic nationalist movement, a folkish movement that identified the political apparatus with the people in a manner that is recognized by the slogan, blood and soil. That term is used in reference to the German nation as a racially defined body. Incidentally, a specifically Germanic expression of the Christian faith helped to make this legible. Such ideas were already present in Germany in its earliest days. Bonhoeffer was 8 years old when World War I began in 1914, and he was 12 when it ended in 1918. There was great pride in Germany in 1914 at the start of World War I, but it was gone at the war's end in 1918. Germany lost the war, and with several major moves, the Allied nations who beat them, their imperial neighbors in Europe, mired Germany in guilt and shame. They were made to accept all blame for the war. They were stripped of their colonies and no longer considered among the world's civilized nations, responsible for spreading culture and civilization. France placed troops from their African colonies on the border between France and Germany, a move that humiliated them and stoked fears of reverse colonization. Allies used the language of barbarian and savage to describe Germans, the very language used by imperial nations in reference to their colonized their colonized subjects, and the yet-to-be colonized of Europe. They had something taken from them. This is the language of the white nationalist and the fascist. The greatness that was yours, that belongs to you, has been taken from you by force, unjustly. The German Workers' Party was a small white nationalist movement that began in the national anxieties of post-World War I Germany in an effort to lure workers away from Marxist socialism. By 1928, it was the National German Workers' Party, the Nazis, with a surprisingly large following. Hitler was their front person. With a keen eye for what moved the people, Hitler made surgical use of the nation's concerns. He gained notoriety and political power on the promise to make Germany great again. Painted a picture of the nation's pre-World War I mythic greatness. This is the pic. This actually, where's that slide? Oh, I didn't put it in there. Oh, that's the one I want. This is the one I wanted you to see. Gained notoriety and political power on the promise to make Germany great again, painted a picture of the nation's pre-World War I mythic greatness while stoking their anger at those who had stolen it from them. Enemies from within were to blame. As he described it, white European colonization of other lands was good for the advancement of civilization, but potential colonization of European spaces by inferior races spelled doom for the future of the nation. And with a simplified populist explanation of Germany's losses, he claimed that this devastating reverse colonization had happened against the German people. He gave a Jewish face to that malevolent colonizing enemy from within as the source to all of their woes, as scholar Marcia Klotz described. That's too small, sorry. It was the Jews who had set one European nation against another in the Great War. Jews who had set one class against another. Jews who had allowed African troops to occupy the Rhineland. Jewish colonization adopted an ideological disguise, misleading the German worker with the false egalitarianism of Marxist doctrine. In that guise, the Jewish colonizers threatened the future of the entire globe. A menacing, polluting presence. The Jews were to blame for it all. They were a lethal ethno-racial pathogen, and thus racial hygiene was critical care necessary for the recovery of national greatness. Check the borders, make sure we maintain purity of the citizenry in order to restore our greatness. This message was central to Nazi cultural ambitions at home and foundational for all their corresponding global vision. Key to Nazi ambitions was a racially pure white nation. Race mixing was an abomination, as Hitler described in Mein Kampf. Quote, "For in a hybridized, negrified world, all conceptions of an idealized future would be lost. The revived Germany would be populated by an idealized folk." Sorry, would be lost was the end of his quote. "The revived Germany would be populated by an idealized folk, the Aryan, who was ethnically pure white and sacred," as he describes, quote, "He who dares to lay a hand upon the highest image of the Lord sins against the benevolent creator of this miracle and helps in the expulsion from paradise," end quote. There was no question that white, image bearer of God, is the apotheosis of human. It is sacred. White nationalism meant citizenry maintained by this devotion to this type of citizen. What I have thus offered is a cursory engagement with the ethnic crisis of Germany's post-war movement. Let me also show this excitement present over the revival and the admonition that you are not barbaric and savage. You are white. Indeed, you are the apotheosis of white. It makes sense of this kind of representation in our time. You can't see it over here. Sorry, I'll just show it to you. This is not from Nazi Germany. This is taken off the internet last week. You recognize what is happening here. The black, feminine, demonic hand being arrested with the rainbow flag in tow by deity. White man. It is important to know that Nazi Germany's government was a single-party government, silencing all opposition violently and synchronizing all areas of society, including the Protestant church, according to the strong leader principle. Nearly all Christians in Germany embraced the vile racist vision for the country and were permissive of its corresponding terrible impact on their non-Aryan neighbors. They were permissive of it, apathetic about it, or participating in it. They didn't view social and political concerns as within the scope of their Christian moral responsibility, and they did not view their suffering as within the scope of their moral responsibility. They too were excited for the vision set before them by Germany's white nationalist government. This is, I'm wrapping up here. During his student days, Bonhoeffer spoke as one who was excited by the folkish movement. But at the end of his student years, after a postgraduate year in New York, which is what I wrote about, in lay leadership at a Black Baptist church, Bonhoeffer sounded different. His neighbor was the concern of the gospel, and the folkish pride causing one to disregard the plight of your neighbor was an unpardonable sin. In our context today, it goes without saying that there are many things that are different than Nazi Germany. It's not the 1930s or 40s. It makes no sense to look for a checklist for comparison. Yet it does help to point out that today there are many books written analyzing that catastrophe and how it happened. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was assembled by the United Nations, both of which were a result of that catastrophic moment. United Nations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are many in this country and the world who oppose this country's white nationalist political and religious movement. Unlike Nazi Germany, we have a two-party system, however defunct it is right now. and an independent judiciary that is currently placing obstacles in the path of this administration's racially hegemonic agenda. And yet, with all that in place, we have arrived at a moment in U.S. history where the government is once again overtly white nationalist. Pictures like this make sense. It leans into the religious assembly of an idealized human embedded with a religiously mythic past that has been robbed from the nation by a dangerous racial presence. Immigrants are poisoning the blood of the nation. A hybridized populace, that is the subject of a historically destructive faith commitment. That language, I'm saying, is a history of a historically destructive faith commitment. He claimed, this leader today of this country, Hitler did some good things. And that he'd like some generals like the Nazis. And then, oh no, I didn't say that. And though regular comments like these from the highest office in the land are terrifying, what is most apprehending in is the religious devotion to a world promised by him. In opposition to his government, Bonhoeffer would often talk about God's care for real people in the real world over and against people who love idealized people in a fictional world. That the Christian eschews the ideal for the real, the actual neighbor in the real world where God demands that we make decision for or against our actual, not our idealized neighbor.
Thank you. Earlier this week, as a Los Angeles Dodgers fan, I was watching the game in Japan, and when the Dodgers start, it's one great hitter after another. I think Ohtani might bat cleanup nowadays, and he might be the best ever. I can tell you I'm no Ohtani, but I will do my best as the cleanup hitter. See what we can bring together here. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, into some of the social science weeds that we've been dipping our toes into. I have 3 points I want to make in this conversation. First, I'll overview ongoing concerns that social scientists have about how Christian nationalism is theorized and measured. And I'll sometimes abbreviate Christian nationalism as CN because I'm going to say it a lot. Second, I'll share some new data on local elected officials, what we might call a front line of democracy in the United States. These data illustrate how CN works differently, or in this case, minimally, dependent on context and roles. And third, I'll use the example of how local elected officials talk about church-state separation to suggest that an overuse of CN as an interpretive lens can impede insight about how Americans in general understand religion-state boundaries. Now, my main engagement as a sociologist with Christian nationalism was an article that a former graduate student, Jesse Smith, and I published together a few years ago. As you can probably infer from the title, we had some opinions and we had a few concerns. One set of concerns was empirical. We argued that much of the sociological CN research was premised on what's known as the religious congruence fallacy, the assumption that there is a congruence between religious belief, attitude, and action. The social science literature is actually rife with statistical associations between CN and various other variables, but there have been few good explanations for supposed congruence. In the past few years, though, people like Ryan, Paul Lejup, Andrew Lewis, and others have started to make some good headway in showing mechanisms behind potential congruence. Another empirical concern we had was the use of a linear quantitative scale made up of 5 or 6 questions to measure CN. And Ryan overviewed this earlier, and the scale, I think 0 to 30, it might have been showing on your slides, is what I'm talking about here. Our concern was that a continuous scale implies that CN is a continuous phenomenon. We instead argued that CN is mostly a categorical phenomenon that exists alongside other categories of attitudes about church and state relationships. So I'm going to throw a crazy diagram at you, and I'll talk you through it. So one suggestion we had in that paper was to use different methods with the same CN survey questions that Ryan showed and that other authors use. This slide shows how we used a statistical grouping method with the exact same questions to uncover 6 categories instead of a continuum. The bars in each of these 6 categories show different patterns of response to those CN questions. Now, we still identified 20% of the population as categorically Christian nationalists, but more importantly, we showed that to understand the categories for the rest of the general public, we needed other concepts beyond CN, like religious conservatism, republicanism, civicness, or secularism. The rest of the general public is not merely low on the continuous scale of CN. The second set of concerns we had was theoretical. We pointed out that the early writing on CN called it variously an ideology, a framework, a social identity, a set of symbols, and a worldview. These are very different forms of culture, which work in very different ways. We argued that as social scientists at least study CN, analysts should identify what form of culture they're analyzing and how that form of culture might actually work. Now, this is especially important when analyzing language, which Ryan actually was referring to at the end there. When ideologues and elites talk about CN, their talk tends to be coherent, detailed, and clearly connected to preferred horrific policy actions. This sort of ideological talk is well covered in work by Anthea, Matthew Taylor, Catherine Stewart, and others. But when other people talk, which is most people, the words they say may not be reflective of deep commitments or predictive of policy views. Or more simply put, the same words may mean very different things and be put to different uses. Okay, so as you can tell, it was a bit of a dense article, but it's a background for the rest of my remarks, so let me get going on those. So on to point 2. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on a very important subpopulation, local elected government officials in the United States. These are the 300,000 or so mayors, borough presidents, city council persons, county supervisors who govern nearly 30,000 different communities, from small towns like mine to huge counties like Los Angeles. Is CN as prevalent among these people? Does CN work in the same way? My collaborators and I fielded the American Local Leaders Survey in 2023. The survey is representative of local elected officials by size of community. The survey covered a ton of topics and had a measure of CN. We used the most strict single measure of CN, whether the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation, something that Ryan mentioned earlier. Based on this question, about 14% of local elected officials are Christian nationalists. Now, this is low compared to the general public, which on this measure is about 21% from the slides that Ryan was showing. Now, if the question was tweaked a bit to include Clarence Thomas's opinion that states can establish religions, even fewer local officials agree. Now, beyond simple presence of CNs, we were interested to know whether officials might be affected in some way by CN beliefs. On one set of measures about fundamental elements of liberal democracy, the answer is no. In these slides, we put the levels of Christian nationalism question across the horizontal axis at the bottom. The vertical axis reflects levels of agreement with a question. In the background, we've controlled for things like personal religiosity, education, age, community size, and that sort of thing. Here, on this question, a high level of officials, both Democratic and Republican, think democracy is the best system of government. CN has no significant impact. Medium-high levels of both Democrats and Republicans think law is fair. Now, while there is a gap between officials of different parties, with Republicans more likely to think law is fair, CN, again, had no significant impact. This slide shows that high, nearly identical levels of both Democratic and Republican officials think religious freedom is a fundamental right. Though higher levels of CN appear visually to decrease the support a bit, the decrease is actually not statistically significant. So to summarize, with local elected officials, CN does not appear to have the notable effects it does in the general public in terms of liberal democracy. However, one area where CN does appear to impact their attitudes is on so-called social identity or wedge issues. For both Democrats and Republicans, CN significantly decreases support for a restroom gender identity policy. And for officials from both parties, CN significantly increases support for a policy that emphasizes states' rights in the Civil War. So why these mixed results? For the results where CN has an impact, it appears to be operating in a way that we know it operates, as a social identity, activating racial and gender hierarchies that we've heard about tonight. But why the different results on democratic liberalism, which don't match the effect of CN in the general public? Now, in forthcoming research, we show that local officials are especially trusting of government institutions, like elections. Also, their roles as elected officials have made them beneficiaries of and pragmatic experts on liberal democracy, so they're likely to support it. Now, a main reason for our project was to examine how religion-state relations actually work at the local level. We wanted to understand whether and how Supreme Court decisions that expanded the claims of religious liberty and promoted religion into government spaces actually impacted local life. The interface of church and state is precisely the area where CN should be most powerful and worrisome, as it promotes an exclusive religious identity as part of the government. In reality, CN's effects on local elected officials' views towards church-state issues are actually limited. For example, we find medium-high levels of support among local elected officials for public holiday displays. The levels are similar by political identity, and the effects of CN are not significant. On the topic of some type of prayer at public meetings, we find differences by political identity, but again, the effect of CN is not significant. Here, we asked officials whether charities and churches should be charged a fee for public services. Some municipalities do this because of low real estate tax income. About half of officials support such billing. Notably, though, there is no significant effect of CN. And then we fielded our survey just after the Groff DeJoy ruling came from the Supreme Court, which increased the hardship that employers, including the government, had to endure when employees claimed religious work exemptions. Surprising to us, actually, we found that only a very small portion of officials supported the ruling, and neither political identity nor CN had an effect. Now, CN does have a minimal impact here. Republicans with high CN are more likely to want their own religious tradition represented in prayer at a meeting. So if they're Catholic, they want a Catholic prayer. If they're Protestant, they want a Protestant prayer. Note, though, that support for this position in general is quite low. So the overwhelming conclusion is that at the local level, most officials are not supportive of a fusion of one type of Christianity with government. Again, what's puzzling about this conclusion is that these are precisely the issues where we would expect CN to have an effect. Why? We think it's primarily because local officials are in charge of administering the basic task of government. And they do so in a context of intense accountability among diverse publics. We've learned that for local officials, seeking to avoid conflict, both legal and social, is high priority. So a takeaway from all this is that the effects of CN, beyond some classic social identity issues, appear dependent on context and role. But if CN doesn't shed much light on religion state officials for local officials, than what does. I'm going to be a little playful in the rest of my remarks here. In the remaining few slides, I showed that listening to how officials talk about religion-state issues helps us move past just focusing on CN to understand other conceptual categories of how religion-state interaction can work. So 6 months after our survey, we put our graduate students to work, and they started having follow-up conversations with these local officials who we had surveyed. Our interviewers specifically did not use church-state separation language or Christian nationalist language. We allowed language to bubble up. What we found was that the metaphor of separation came up again and again and again. Now, CN theory implies that being opposed to separation means being supportive of church-state fusion. And in this quote, we see support for this. An official with the highest level of CN on the survey measure mocks the, quote, separation of church and state. This person is clearly for integration of government and Christianity through prayer. But the logic of continuous CN theory also implies that being supportive of separation indicates being supportive of the opposite end of the scale, usually labeled secularism. Is this the case? Here, confusingly, for the continuous logic of CN, someone who disagrees with CN also disagrees with separation. The official explained to the interviewer how the government partners with religious groups. For them, talk about separation is not about secularism, but a tool to articulate how government should engage with religious groups equitably. And here, an official fully opposed to CN seems at first to be committed to secularist separation, but immediately explains how their government actually hosts a holiday display with different religious elements. Again, talk about separation is not about secularism, but a tool to explain that government, in this case, should give groups equal opportunity. So with these few examples, I wanted to show the utility of listening beyond CN diehards. Doing so helps us to categorize the majority of Americans in ways not driven by the CN scale. So I've covered a ton of ground, and it's getting late, so let me summarize my 3 points. First, there are meaningful methodological and conceptual debates that can help to clarify CN, while also providing insight into other categories of Americans. Second, the effects of CN differ by subpopulation. Among local officials, CN is less impactful than the general public. The roles and contexts of these officials appear to limit its effect. And third, tracing language helps reveal categories of church-state attitudes beyond CN. Commonly used language with diverse meanings, like separation, may provide a way forward to contest Christian nationalism and to articulate religious equality and religious pluralism in the United States. I'll end with a picture of my 4 beautiful collaborators and an advert for our project where we'll have a lot more publications coming soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks to each of you. And I promised that I'd explain the Q&A process. So the first thing I'd like to do is just to invite us to take, again, some time for silence. And in that time, I would invite you to consider whether you would like to submit a question to one of the panelists or more than one using this QR code. And that code takes you to a form where you can type in your question. And then we will curate those questions and select some to pose. So first, let's just take a moment to center ourselves again. And so if you would like to, please go ahead and use the code to submit a question. I believe these mics are on, and I think we could just sit down and take the questions. So we do have the first question. You sometimes hear MLK would be labeled a Christian nationalist based on popular scales. Could you discuss progressive Christians engaging in policy and justice work that's not nationalistic? And that is open for anyone.
Yeah, so it is it's common, I guess, in some circles to hear King talked about in the language of Christian nationalists. The first thing that comes to mind when I hear that is the fact that the country has still failed to recalibrate what we mean by Christian after the Civil War. So there are, I mean, in large notion, the whole concept of Christian and human still remains locked in this tension of definition and hierarchy. So one might say King is Christian nationalist. Now this is just me off the top of my head. A Christian nationalism that says all God's children are made equal. That is within the vein of Christian thought that was Harriet Tubman's faith tradition. What would that look like? Would there be something hegemonic as a part of the notion that justice is the way of Jesus? So, I mean, it just seems it's another way of saying like you can't put this Christian side by side with the Strom Thurmond Christian and call them both Christians worshiping the same God with the same kind of more ethical calculus. It just doesn't make any sense. So to use Christian nationalism in reference to him in that way it just
say the thing I want to say, and don't be offended, whoever asked this question. It's the way that this question is framed is like what Republicans did to King the whole time.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
The way this question is framed is like you want to put him in a certain space to make him a certain thing that he wasn't to begin with. And this is why I get so upset every King holiday when, people say, it's not the color of his skin, but the content of your character. That's the only thing they know. They don't know anything else. They don't know the beginning of that speech.
And it's weaponized too.
Yeah, and it's completely weaponized. And that's the way I feel about this question. Forgive me, but I just have to say it because it's like you're trying to put him into a box that he does not fit in.
Right. I mean, he even said you can't worship the God of faith and the God of nationalism.
Exactly. And I mean, he gets more, this is the thing, King gets more radical towards the end.
Right.
And when here I'm going to tell a story of myself. I only came on Fox News twice.
Yeah, I saw
One of the reasons.
With Hannity.
With Hannity. And you know who was on that day? Remember who was on? No. Alveda King.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
And what did we get in an argument about? We got in an argument about, I said to her, King did not believe Jesus was like the Son of God, okay? You got to understand the way he was trained and what this was going on, but he could preach Jesus. Right. She got me, oh no, he was saved and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, when? So this was a huge thing. Yeah. And so, when people, when you put these things on historic figures, this is why my comments were not so much about history, but about the present. Because and this is no offense to Reggie, but it's sort of like if we don't understand who these historical figures are in the first place, in the context they are, you have missed a boat.
Right. Is why you got to place them in context.
Yes.
I'll give you a good William James Bryan. Anybody a William James Bryan fan? I was born and raised in Salem, Illinois. It's where he was born and raised. Yep. He believed the earth was created in 6 literal days. That's right. But he also said no one can earn $1 million honestly. So he was like a Bernie Sanders socialist mixed with Jerry Falwell, which made perfect sense in 1896 and makes no sense at all in 2025. I think that's, Yeah,
that's exactly it. I mean, and I teach him in class and my students are like, what? They do not understand this. Yeah. They're like, but this guy, and I'm like, no, you got to take him where he is. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything?
I was just going to make an offhand comment that I grew up south of Ryan in Terre Haute, hometown of Eugene Debs. Oh, wow. But that takes us on a whole nother conversation.
Conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Well, another question. I would like the panelists, but especially Professor, but there's no name, to reflect on the violent work that the construct of the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian has done.
Another made-up term. You asked me? Oh, okay, thank you. I was going to say, probably I'm Professor Blank, that's true. That's how. Oh, no, that's great. I mean, that's violent work. I mean, I think about, I teach a class called God and Money, right? And I talk about this construct because I use Kevin Cruz's book, because I think it's a really great, exposition on, this marriage of business and basically Christianity. And I think the violent work of it, I'm going to say something very different about this term, okay? It's the term that makes Christian Zionism work, okay? And so the people I look at, like 59 for Israel and all this stuff, it's that term that puts everything together. The first time I went to Israel, I still have this magnet. It's an American flag and an Israeli flag together, okay? And that idea is embedded in something. I'll never forget what I asked the people that I was with. I said, do you understand that, evangelical Christians want you to get saved so Jesus can come back and we can have this thing on the plain of Megiddo and let it die? And they're like, no, we like it because they give us money. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but it was about the support. It was about, the things that you get because of this relationship. So that term, which is a made-up term, please understand this, it's not a real term, gets bandied about as a way to talk about what these values are supposed to be, or to what the monotheistic values are supposed to be, if I want to put it in religious studies terms. So yeah, I do think there's a violence about the term, but the violence comes from the misunderstanding that you think these two things are together, when in fact they're really not together. And as a matter of fact, one wants to usurp the other.
I'll give you a quick anecdote. I tweeted about transgender rights views amongst evangelicals and Jews, and they were completely different, right? And a high-ranking official in the first Trump administration tweeted me and said, Judeo-Christian values, I guess, right? Like that, now that they've split, like the evangelicals want to walk away from that term because Jews tend to be more liberal on social issues and evangelicals want to be more conservative. So I even think there's a rift happening inside. They don't even like that term anymore. And I just think it's an interesting, we liked it when we all agreed on things, and now we disagree and we don't like that word anymore.
We liked it when we showed the 10 Commandments before the Easter.
That's exactly right.
If you're American, this is the Cecil B. DeMille version.
Yeah.
I think that's an important question, and thank you for asking it. I think that's a very important question. I think one of the things hiding inside of the concept of that wedding is supersessionism.
Yes.
I mean, just to name it, one of the things that's hiding in there, the way that Jew then enters into the Western lexicon in a favorable way, as the pillar on which the Christian West is built. It is a supersessionist move on one hand. It also turns the nation state of Israel into the friend of the West as the appropriate Semitic people over and against the inappropriate Semitic people. So we don't remember that there are actually more Semitic people there. So anyway.
Can you just do for everybody, because, I said it, but you said it nicer. Can you just define supersessionism for them so they understand what it is? Because that's such a theological term.
I'm sorry.
I said it, but I said it in my way, and you said it the way you should have said it. That's it.
Supersessionism is the replacement theory, the belief that Christianity is the replacement for God in the narrative of God's work in history.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. This is a question for Professor Adler. Professor Adler's data about local officials is surprising. So many stories coded, quote unquote, Christian nationalists appear to take place on the local level. For example, religion and public schools. Why is there a discrepancy between CN among local officials and the public discourse around local politics and Christian nationalism?
I'll take a stab and see what happens. One thing that I don't think was in Ryan's slides, it weren't mine, was that classic survey question about prayer in schools. Oh, yeah. Is that right? So for decades now, after the 1950s Supreme Court's decisions that did not take prayer out of schools, but made unconstitutional confessional leading of prayer in schools by administrators and teachers, sociologists have asked that question about prayer in public schools. I'm actually glad we don't use it, because I think it's become an identity statement that says more just in a Christian nationalist way. It's a complaint about a supposed secularism in schools that's being taught to children. So the questioner asked that question, but you'll note none of my data were about superintendents or teachers. I have that data, but that's for another conference. I think the big difference is that we see in our interviews, and we've also been in 8 communities around the country for about 7 years, talking with religious leaders. So we've been talking about both sides of the religion-state divide, if you will, is a sensitivity to avoid, even if people want to say it forthrightly, a kind of hegemonic Christianity at the local level. Now, that being said, there are a lot of places in the country where the hegemony is Judeo-Christianity, and that's the language that we hear. But local officials have to do a lot of dancing around this. And to be honest, one of the biggest reasons that they don't engage in more of this is straight up legal. A lawsuit can sink a municipality. And there's a feverish fear of lawsuits from groups like the ACLU. They showed up in our data. People said we're afraid of those sorts of lawsuits. But it has a real power on people at the local level. But the other type of conflict I mentioned, besides the legal, was social. We all know the waves of stories about people at school boards and how people are being attacked and they're doxxed and their homes staked out, school board commissioners. And local government officials, they want to make sure the utility lines got up and you got water. And basically anything that prevents that, pragmatism, may not get them reelected, but also causes conflict that they're trying to avoid happen at a local level. So I know this is kind of a pragmatic utilitarian response, but I really think there's something to it, besides the fact that they're also elected, right? So they have to, once again, if they want to continue, actually win an election, win a majority of local people. And playing just at the polls in elections doesn't always work at the local level.
I'd like to put forth a couple of questions now. One is specifically for you, Professor Butler. Professor Butler opened by referring to renditions, persecution, people taken from communities as a crisis in the Trump administration. Yet many of these things are true of recent Democratic administrations as well. Obama expanded secure communities, quote unquote. Family separations continued under Biden, drone strikes, renditions, and of course the Gaza genocide. And then another person's question. As a transgender Catholic man, I feel the anxiety of this present moment, but also solidarity with all the marginalized groups who have been here before. Recent comments by Musk and others on social media have been that empathy is a sin. I see how empathy could, quote unquote, dilute the purity of white nationalism. How do we choose what language and methodology to use to fight against Christian nationalism today? And then a third questioner is asking about practical actions that we can take to combat white Christian nationalism. So maybe Professor Butler, you could start and then we can.
Yeah, I can start. The person who said the first one about Obama, everything, please do not be deceived. I didn't like it when Obama was doing it. I didn't like it when Biden was doing it. What is different about this time, and let me be clear about what is different this time. What is clear about this time is that this is being used for authoritarian purposes, to scare people, to that you don't take C-130s to take people out of the country. This is very different. And before when people were happening, I didn't like the family separation thing. I didn't like any of this stuff. I'm from Texas. I can't stand this happening. Okay, I don't care what president is doing it. But I think what is different about now is that we're sending people, when I say rendition, rendition is a very specific word. Rendition is what happened when they were taking people to Guantanamo, or you went into Black Ops or something else. And basically, this is what's happened to all those men who got sent down to Venezuela. That is rendition. That is not just simply taking somebody and putting them somewhere because of immigration. They are in a prison. They are going to have to work in a prison. And so that's the difference here, is that this is a show of force to keep people in line. And they will continue to do this. This is why people are fighting right now and having suits about coming into schools and places of worship. This is serious business. And so while, I can appreciate what you said, I also want you to know that it's not as though I'm sitting up here and didn't know it was happening for everybody else. It's my job to know what happens with everybody else. But I need to tell you that this time is different and you need to be paying attention. That's the first thing. Let me answer the thing about empathy, and I'm gonna let everybody else go. I think empathy is key, because if you cannot find yourself in solidarity with what is happening to people right now, whether they've lost their jobs, whether they've been picked up, but ICE got them, whether there's some family member that was, I have empathy for the people who voted for Trump and, have found themselves in this really weird place because this is not what they voted for. And I'm like, why don't you come join the rest of us who are trying to figure out what to do here? I think that's the conversation we have to have. I don't know how we save this nation unless we have a conversation with these people. But I'm going to tell you that they don't want to have a conversation with me in the body that I'm in. This is the whole point about me saying white Christian nationalism, because I can't go to things. Back in 2011, I'll tell a story how long I've been doing this. I was tracking Palin back in 2007, 2008, and have been watching this thing the whole time. I used to go to rallies. I used to go to all of this stuff. Nobody at a Palin, when Palin was thinking about running for president, ever said anything to me. People would talk to me. It was great. But when Trump came out, I'm like, I can't go to this. I'm going to get beat up. I'm going to have something happen to me. And that is because the level of violence that is perpetrated upon people of color. I don't know how to make you understand that for the trans person in here who said that this is frightening. I have a friend who has a trans child right now, and I don't know what's going to happen because they're trying to figure out: do I move? Do I do this? Do I do that? Can what's going to happen when the transition is complete? What are all these things that are going to be? What are the questions? How do you get abused? We've had cases of kids that have been bullied. Just to think about what happens to adults that have gone through this process and can't have the right gender marker on their passport or their driver's license that's being rescinded. Wherever you are in this thing, whether you believe in that or not, the question is would you want somebody to do that to you? That's having empathy.
I finished a manuscript for a book called The Vanishing Middle: How the Decline of Moderate Congregations Hurts Faith, Democracy, and Us. And the argument I make there is that if you look at religious traditions over the last 50 years, there was a period of time where they were actually mixed politically. And it wasn't that long ago, by the way. It was like 30 years ago, late 1980s. Mainline, evangelical, Catholic Church were mixed. Like you were 45-45, right? And the problem is we don't know anyone who's not us anymore. And it's easy to hate somebody you don't know. That's the thing I realize. We create the worst version of the other side in our minds and then hate that version of it. Not everyone who voted for Trump's a racist. Not everyone who voted for, Harris was a socialist, right? We can't put people in these big categories, but here's the problem. If I sit next to Bob in church every day and Bob votes for someone I don't like, I don't hate Bob, because you know what? I know Bob. I know his background, I know his past, I know his history, I know his family. I know he loves his church and loves his country. The problem is we don't know people like Bob anymore because we hang out with people who are just like us. And the problem is we're going to have to be really uncomfortable to work in spaces where you have to be with people who are different than us and have hard conversations. And the church used to be that way. The white church used to be that way. I think the black church does a much better job of diversity and all those things. The white church has become a monolith now. And don't talk to me about the main line, by the way. The main line was 58% of America in 1955. Now they're 10% of America. 1.5% of all Americans are mainline Protestants under the age of 40. All right, there is no functional mainline Protestant Christianity in America in 30 or 40 years. It doesn't work. So guess what happens if you stand in the middle of the road? You get hit by cars coming and going. And unfortunately, that's what happened to white Christianity in America. And I would just argue for, if you don't have a space in your life where you interact with people who voted for someone different than you, then why not? Then why not? You should. Because empathy is not a sin. It's not. It's actually what makes us human. My faith teaches me when something bad happens to somebody else, it wouldn't be sucks to be you. It's there, but for the grace of God, I go. And that's how we learn empathy, is by being around people who are different than us. And I think religion used to be, and it's not anymore, it used to be a great place where we mixed and mingled and saw different backgrounds. And we don't now, and I think we're worse for it, as individuals, as a country, and as a church. And we can fix it if we wanted to. Sorry, I got to preach there, my bad.
No, that was a good preach. Let me say one more thing that relates to, sitting by Bob in church. Yeah. The big thing that we didn't even touch on, but I could take hours to talk about, is disinformation.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and the ways in which disinformation moved. When I mentioned COVID, that was the way that people sat at home by themselves and read things on Facebook and the internet and didn't know how to discern what was truth from what was fiction. We all know somebody like this. And the conspiracy theories morphed. Mm-hmm. And so their family members that can't talk to each other now, because either somebody was in QAnon or they were doing something else, or they might be a traditionalist Catholic who has a lot of ideas about, the Pope is the Antichrist and all this other stuff, right? And so that also is the divider here, in that I think we cannot decently talk about this without having to mention disinformation, and to mention the fact that the people who want this country divided have a ton of money, okay? And the money drives a lot of this stuff. And so if you have money, you can do whatever you want. Exhibit A, Elon Musk, you can buy your way into the White House. You can have your kid riding on Air Force One with the president. I mean, who would have ever thought that somebody would have a kid that put a booger on the Resolute desk? I'm sorry, that to me is like the nadir moment for this whole thing. Is like when that kid was in there, basically saying, I'm running this and I'm digging my nose and do this to the desk, right? So I think you have to realize how much these kinds of things affect people, and how hard it is to even have that conversation with Bob if Bob's, stream of information comes from a very different space, and he can't hear you because you're trying to just tell him, the sky is blue today, and he's like, well, no, it's red.
About empathy. On one hand, empathy is a pro-social concept. Empathy means that we have the capacity to be disturbed by something bad happening to someone else that we see. Martin Hoffman, in a book on empathy that he wrote, as speaking that way about empathy as pro-social, talks about a concept of empathic distress. To describe it, he tells a story of a child walking with her mother. She's 6. She sees a little boy of her age crash on his bike in front of them. She turns and hugs mom's leg, crying. She didn't crash, but she saw him crash, and it bothered her. Empathic distress. Empathy can be dysfunctional when I take on what happened to you as my own experience. That's a dysfunctional experience of empathy. But there's another way of empathy being dysfunctional. It could use it as a weapon. In her book, Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya Hartman talks about the slave coffle, them being told to step lively and look happy before they step outside of the holding where they are being prepped for the market, being told to step lively and look happy. No frowns, no mourning or else. So on their way to the market, they step lively and look happy. White people seeing them know that if they were in that position, there is no way that they could step lively and look happy. Therefore, they must be in a natural condition. In that suffering, empathy working in that situation then to distort what they see. How can I, in my practice of empathy, identify with what I'm seeing in your experience of suffering? There is a need to be careful when we are making an effort to empathize too. That's important to recognize. Another thing that we struggle with empathy, and there was a number of years ago where my grad school was partnering with a local school to talk about empathy. The other school was scientists, and they had their quantified studies and so forth and data, and they were using people and robots. We could empathize, as they discovered, with people like us, but we certainly couldn't empathize with a machine or a dog or a tree. Now, I'm a dog person. I can, it bugs me. But how does that translate? What does that mean for us? What we mean by human matters. How we understand human matters. Who we value matters for the practice of empathy. If I'm sitting next to Bob in church and Bob doesn't recognize me as human, I don't know, it doesn't matter how Bob voted for me. We need to recognize what we mean by difference too. Your different belief in me doesn't mean that you are persecuted if I don't believe what you do. But my difference in this body is different than your belief system. We need to understand that difference. We also, the use of terms like prejudice, xenophobia, racism always confuse us. They're so confusing. I tried to offer a set of a clarifying sense of what is meant by racism in an essay that I wrote after George Floyd was murdered. And I gave a sense of that here today when talking about an idealized type and the notion of race itself as an argument for that idealized type. So then in the history of the development of human difference, the Ashanti didn't know they were Black until they met the European. The Apache didn't know they were red until they met the European. They were pulled into an argument for human difference that was an apologetic for an ascendant type. It is the manufacture and the maintenance of systems and structures for whites only. That is racism. So, one can be kind and benevolent. You just know what people's races are. You don't mean anything by it. We often live and move in societies where that understanding of human difference is just normal. It's coming in contact with it that makes the difference, meaning how it's operating in the way we interact with each other. That is important.
I could just pick up on Reggie's point about contact. So I think some of what the problem we have now, or the reason why the churches worked at one point, was because not only were there different people in those church basements, but as others have called them, schools of democracy, they were different people who were arguing about things that had a bite to it. Like there was money on the line, there was public identity on the line, what are we going to do with this building on the line? And Robert Putnam, it's been 25 years now since his work, and I hate to tell you this, but the latest reports, it's not like there's an upswing on engagement or involvement in civic life in the United States. And having studied local government now, I'm convinced, I don't want to be Pollyannish, not everything is great at the local level, but your local government is a place where there's bite, right? Your taxes are on the table, your school kids' textbooks are on the table, whether there's fluoride in the water, it's all on the table. And the only people figuring those things out are the people that got elected and the people that show up to the meeting. So if people don't show up to those or show up with the heckler's veto, it really morphs like what happens in that setting. But I'm worried with the decline of organized religion, the decline of unions and other spaces where people had these practices of actually deciding something, not just talking, not just sharing opinions or hobbies, but actually kind of getting into the things that bite. And make no mistake, Elon Musk's techno libertarian vision is an anti-democratic vision. The people who are leading the country right now regularly talk about the failure of democracy. Do you want to live in a country where we just can't get things done? That's just hidden language for saying we're unable to make the decisions to live together. But we can't make decisions to live together unless we actually gather together to make those decisions. And I speak partly because I've talked with local officials and local religious leaders, and it's kind of humbling when they talk about people in their local community they really don't like. Like we've talked with atheist town council members about what it feels like to have prayer and their town council. And can you talk to your other council members? And some can and some can't. But what's neat are the cases where they actually will say, you know what, I can't talk to them. And at the end of the day, we'll just have to vote on it. Like there's this incredible like pragmatic realism that happens in these kind of democratic venues. And to just plug some good work on this, there's a sociologist by the name of Francesca Poletta, who has a terrific book called, I think, Ties That Bind, where she traces kind of the collapse of these spaces and what they do, and a new book about to come out about how to change minds or how to change ourselves, where she's a true democratic theorist in a moment where democratic theory is on the line.
I know that we're over time, and I just want to say thanks to each of you for helping get our conference started in a very thoughtful, provocative, and meaningful way. The language of empathy and the notion of engaging with each other in relationship as human beings is a wonderful place to begin the next set of explorations over the next couple of days. So please join me in thanking our panelists.